Welcome to the Talk Like a Leader podcast, where we explore the mindset, skill set, and habit set of leadership communication. Using these tips, techniques, and tactics, you'll be able to talk like a leader to build better relationships and get more done. Your host is Guy Harris, who has more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience in consulting, coaching, and training in areas like team and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, as well as emotional intelligence. Take it away, Guy.
Hi, this is Guy Harris. Welcome to Talk Like a Leader. This week's episode is titled, Beware of Either-Or Interpretations. I'll start with a reference to a leadership definition that I got from John Maxwell years ago. It's a guiding thought for me, one of many definitions of leadership I've read over the years, and one that I find in simplicity and focus is very easy to hold on to. So here it is. Leadership is influence. Like I said, I got that from John Maxwell a number of years ago. Great definition, to the point, very simple. Basically illustrates the idea that if I behave and communicate in a way that another person grants me the opportunity to influence them in some way, then with respect to them at least, I am behaving as a leader. If I've gained influence with a person, then I'm in a leadership position or an opportunity to speak as a leader into this person's life or in relationship with this person. So if I say talk like a leader is about communication, that's what this podcast is about, and you're listening to me today, then I pretty much assume that you desire the ability to gain greater influence with your communication, that you want to develop influence. And additionally, that your preference is to persuade people to take action or to change their behaviors or to take ownership of an issue or to learn a new skill or to do something in a different way or whatever the specific situation calls for in your leadership world, that you are more interested in persuading people than forcing them. That's basically an operating assumption I have in the focus and approach I have to this podcast. It is my focus that I would prefer to gain influence and persuade people in a way that we can both win rather than try to force people to do things. That's my preference, and honestly, I operate on the basis that that is your preference as well. And so I share ideas that I pick up along the line or practice or have observed to work better in that effort, hopefully with the desire that it will help you too. Well, today, I'm going to focus on this idea of either-or interpretations, and it's an idea that comes to mind as I observe the news, social media, common communication patterns, just general things I observe, both in, quote, the world outside me and in my own little pocket of the world. I'll share this idea that I picked up first from the book Crucial Conversations. And if you haven't read that book, I recommend it highly. So one axiom of influence and persuasion that comes from Crucial Conversations is that people won't speak with you or they won't speak up until they feel safe. And feel safe basically means with you. So let's extrapolate a bit and say that if people don't feel safe to speak, it's also not likely that they will listen with the desire to hear you out without judging what you say or feeling criticized by what you say or feeling judged by what you say or any number of other negative interpretations. And so when people feel criticized, judged, labeled, they don't feel safe. They probably won't speak. They probably won't be positively influenced. They probably won't be persuaded. This is kind of a general guideline to consider. The idea of either-or interpretation strikes me as something I see commonly, and I was reminded of this as I was reading a book by Adam Grant called Think Again. I've referenced that book before. I'll reference it again today because in this book he has a very interesting piece about a bias that most of us have, and it's in the section of the book that's targeted at persuasion and discussing difficult issues, that kind of things. So what I thought I'd do is read for you this one very specific quote from Adam Grant's book, Think Again, and then share with you what I think that says in terms of our broader leadership communication. And just for reference, it's on pages 164 and 165 of Adam Grant's book, Think Again. And he says, where complicated issues are concerned, seeing the opinions of the other side is not enough. Social media platforms have exposed us to them, but they haven't changed our minds. knowing another side exists isn't sufficient to leave preachers. In the context of Adam Grant's book, he talks about preacher being a form of communication where you know that you're right and you're just trying to force the other person to take your perspective. So knowing another side exists isn't sufficient to leave preachers doubting whether they're on the right side of morality. Prosecutors, another type of communication strategy Grant talks about, the prosecutor approach is like trying to prove the other person wrong. Prosecutors questioning whether they're on the right side, or politicians, another phrase that he uses, politician is the person who's willing to take any perspective just so that the other person will agree. Politicians wondering whether they're on the right side of history. Let me read that sentence again because I broke it up. Knowing another side exists isn't sufficient to leave preachers doubting whether they're on the right side of morality, prosecutors questioning whether they're on the right side of the case, or politicians wondering whether they're on the right side of history. Hearing an opposing opinion doesn't necessarily motivate you to rethink your own stance. It makes it easier for you to stick to your guns. Presenting two extremes isn't the solution, it's part of the polarization problem. Psychologists have a name for this, binary bias. It's a basic human tendency to seek clarity and closure by simplifying a complex continuum into two categories. To paraphrase the humorist Robert Benchley, there are two kinds of people, those who divide the world into two kinds of people and those who don't. So let me back up and read another sentence again. Binary bias is a basic human tendency to seek clarity and closure by simplifying a complex continuum into two categories. Now, the question for today is, what has that got to do with Talk Like a Leader? Now, frankly, I think it has a lot to do with it. And the issue is this. When you are in a coaching conversation with another person, you likely have two slightly different perspectives about the action that needs to be taken, the behavior that needs to change, the results that need to be achieved. Probably they're not identical perspectives. When you're attempting to delegate a task, probably don't have identical perspectives, or it will be frequent that you don't have identical perspectives on how to achieve the outcome or the fastest or best or highest quality way to achieve the outcome. If you are in a conflict situation with a person, then you clearly have different perspectives or you wouldn't be in conflict. Now, what's the point of that? If you want to engage with another person in a way that invites them into the conversation, so in the phrase of crucial conversations, they don't feel threatened or they do feel safe, we've got to find a way to frame the disagreement or to frame the two sides of the issue, not in an either or, meaning one of us is right and one of us is wrong perspective, but instead in a both and viewpoint, meaning both of us have perspectives that are valid. Both of us have viewpoints that are worth considering. And probably, assuming we're both knowledgeable of the situation and we're not total neophytes on the issue at hand, we have at least a grain of truth in our viewpoint on this situation. And what we're trying to do is to figure out how to highlight the truth of both perspectives rather than to focus on the differences. I am talking about complex situations that have multiple ways you could deal with it, that actually could be acceptable ways to deal with it. And what we're wrestling with is the way that we can both agree on. What I'm suggesting is, from a leadership perspective, if we want to engage with our teams in a way that creates clear, concise, open communication, in a way that neither party feels threatened, backed into a corner, both parties feel comfortable that their perspective was heard and understood and at least in some way included in the final solution. We want to avoid this thing that Adam Grant tells us is called binary bias, the temptation, the bias, the natural human tendency to view things in an either-or way, to recognize that virtually all of us have a bias towards trying to simplify complex things and to look for simple answers to complex problems. And one way to talk like a leader is to, in the word of Adam Grant, complexify. Recognize there is complexity to what we're trying to solve, that there are probably multiple, quote, right ways to solve this problem. And our goal in this conversation is not to pick my right way versus your right way. Rather, the goal of this conversation is to find among the family of right ways we could do this complex problem, find a way we can both live with. The idea is this: both and rather than either or. We can complexify. We can recognize there's nuance and subtlety. And that recognizing the validity of another person's perspective does not completely undermine the validity of yours. And honestly, asking them to recognize validity of a piece of your perspective does not completely undermine theirs. We find that middle ground. We find that place where both of us can be okay with the outcome. It's not easy to do. It requires us to basically confront our bias. And that's my encouragement today. Confront the either-or bias or the binary bias that we have in the way we look at complex problems. Learn to complexify or acknowledge the nuance and the subtlety of slightly different perspectives. If you can do that, you can talk like a leader. This has been the Talk Like a Leader podcast. You can listen to this show every week wherever you get your podcast. If you haven't, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. I'm Guy Harris, and thanks for listening.